Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Barron. I'm the Director of Design at Bohemia Interactive Simulations, and my talk is called Depiction of War in Games. Can you do better? For those of you who don't know, Bohemia Interactive Simulations, we've taken the first-person shooter game engine behind the ARMA series of games and turned it into a real-life military simulator that's used to train thousands of soldiers around the world each year. My whole professional career, I've been in and around simulations, the military itself, and war. A little bit about myself. I started off as a modder in 2002 for Bohemia Interactive's first game, Operation Flashpoint. In 2006, I got a job as a designer in their Australian studio, and we started working on Virtual Battlespace 2. This was the military simulator that really changed the defense industry. It became a breakaway success and really changed the way that the military thought of games. They could be serious training tools, not just some experiment or some toy. In 2010, I moved to Orlando when we opened a studio there. But I was also in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. And so, again, in 2010, I actually volunteered for a deployment to Afghanistan. So I was there for about 7 months. And then afterwards, I decided I wanted to go back to Afghanistan. So I went there as a civilian working for DARPA. We were making smartphone apps for soldiers to use in combat. After a year, I decided I was tired of that, and I went back to work for Bohemia, this time in the Prague office. And there goes my slides. All right. And I've been in Prague ever since. So one of the things that I've noticed in my time in defense, in simulations, and around the military is that there's a bit of a disconnect between the expectation and reality of how war is depicted in games and in books and movies compared to how it actually is. And as a veteran, usually for me, when I talk to civilians, this is kind of how the conversations go. You know, it might start off like, hey, I'm off to boot camp. Wish me luck, buddy. And then the friend, just kind of not interested, awesome, kill some bad guys for me. 2 years later, I just got back from Iraq. I had a lot of profound and life-changing experiences. Friend, cool, did you kill anyone? Not very interested. So in general, I would say people have a deep appreciation for the military, but a very shallow understanding of what it is the military does and war itself. And for example, when I was in Afghanistan, I was deployed to Sangin district. And for years, Sangin was the bloodiest battleground in the entire war. Units that were deployed there were suffering 10 to 20% casualties each deployment. Ours was no exception. And one of the reasons it was so bloody is there were IEDs everywhere. It was basically a low-density minefield. So we would walk in single-file line like this. The guy in front would have a minesweeper. Everyone else would walk behind in line. And if you stepped off of the path that had been cleared, you might get blown up. Or sometimes the guy in front might miss an IED, he might step over it, and then the next guy in line might step on it and get blown up. Before I got there, the last unit that was there, they learned the hard way that the insurgents had a little tactic where they would put IEDs down behind cover, so good places to take cover, and then they would set up an ambush. And when the Marines came, they would fire at the Marines. The Marines would run to cover, lay down in those places, and then the insurgents would detonate the IEDs and blow up the Marines. So by the time we got there, we were told if you come under enemy fire, you just stand still and you just squat down, you fire back, and you don't run for cover. So that's pretty much what we were deploying into. And you might imagine from what I described that it must have looked something like this. You know, a lot of shooting, a lot of explosions, exciting stuff. In reality, though, a typical day there looked a lot more like this. And we'd basically be walking around talking to farmers about their donkey or about their house that was destroyed in a low-density minefield, but just walking around talking. And in the middle of this deployment, there was a young Marine. I remember very clearly he had this quote. He said, "This isn't what I expected. I thought I'd be doing hero shit, like in Call of Duty." So what you might not realize is that your work as writers and as game developers really matters. It really helps set the expectation that society has of what war is and what the military is. And the reason for this is because as people, we're designed to learn through stories and through play and through emotions. We don't learn from history or long-form journalism, unfortunately. So really, you are society's teachers in a way. So my question is, what lessons are we teaching? Let's take an analogy. Let's say we were tasked with writing a movie about relationships. This is something that most of us have all experienced. So we could brainstorm a lot of different themes or different narrative topics that we could focus on. Love, dating, romance, maybe heartbreak, marriage. We have this huge narrative canvas that we can choose from to write about. Now, what if, as we're brainstorming, a movie executive comes up to us and says, hey, we did a lot of market research, and we've learned what excites our audience the most. I want you to focus just on this one theme, sex. What kind of movie would be writing at this point? I mean, obviously we'd be making porn at this point, which may be exciting, but it's a bit shallow. And although in a relationship, often there is sex, of course, but you wouldn't really say that a porn is about relationships. So let's say we're going to write about war. How big is our narrative canvas? What are all the themes that we tend to choose from when we're writing? I would argue that it's fairly narrow most of the time. And really the purpose of this speech is to give you a few examples of what else is out there, what else we can fit in this narrative. So to get started, my first narrative is less killing, more war. What do I mean by that? One of the things I've found over the years that's very interesting about working on military simulations is the difference between what's really in like a military FPS versus what gamers think must be in there. And I would say in general, video games are much, much more violent than real military operations or military simulations. And I mean orders of magnitude more violent. So for example, when the military is going to attack something, some defenders that are in a dug-in position, typically they want to use 3 times as many soldiers as the defenders have. So if there's 30 defenders, you would attack with 90 soldiers. So let's say we have a level in a video game where we're going to attack an enemy base, and we're going to do it alone. And let's say there's 30 soldiers in that base. Essentially, that level, you would be having the player doing the killing that would normally be done by 90 soldiers in real life. In other words, you could say that that level would be 90 times more violent than a military simulation. And this, of course, really makes sense if the only gameplay mechanics you have revolve around shooting, because you have no other tool in your toolkit to work with. So some games, like Arma, for example, make simple changes to their game mechanics that really change how combat behaves. So for example, bullets can kill you easily. If you get shot in the face, you don't get to heal. These types of changes really make the player more cautious and much more hesitant to get involved in a firefight. And by letting you have a bunch of friendly troops, dozens of friendly troops, troops with you, it really lets it look more like a real-life military operation. The other thing is, a lot of the combat in this game is about positioning yourself before you get into a firefight. And so it really gives the player something to do other than just shooting a gun. But even in milsim games like Arma, the feature set tends to focus mainly on killing. And you might find it interesting, but in military simulations, we actually have a lot of features that you would never really expect to find in a first-person shooter. Excuse me. So for example, here's a convoy training in Iraq. In early 2000s, the US Marine Corps was doing a lot of this using our software. And what you can see here is there was a feature that we left out when we made VBS 2. We forgot to include this feature from VBS 1. And it really was crucial for their training. So they wouldn't upgrade to the latest version until we put that feature back in. And of course, the feature I'm talking about is turn signals. This is a critical feature for military training, at least for convoy operations. Why? The reason is, in this case at least, the way the Marine Corps operated was when they were on a convoy, before they made a turn, they would signal. The lead vehicle would signal, the other vehicles would signal behind, and then that way everyone knew the turn was coming and everyone else knew that that had been acknowledged. So they were basically using this to train communication and teamwork, and that's why something that normally you would only see in like a truck simulator game was crucial for military simulations. Here's another example. This was for the New Zealand Defence Force. So again, they wouldn't upgrade from VBS1 to VBS2 because they were doing training for peacekeeping operations in East Timor at the time. And so they were training their rules of engagement, and so of course the most important feature was the ability to put a weapon on your back. So what they were training was if there was a guerrilla fighter and he had a weapon on his back, you kind of leave him alone. If he had a weapon in his hand, he could be shot. He might be threatening you. So this is how something that would basically be an emote in an MMO becomes a critical feature in a real military simulator. And the thing is, in VBS, we have thousands of features, and a lot of them are like this. They're not very violent, not very kinetic. A lot of them are very violent and very kinetic. But the point is, the military has so many different tasks that they have to do in war, hundreds and hundreds of tasks, and that's why we need all these features. And a lot of them you would never really see in a first-person shooter. But because war is so complex, there's so many different things they have to train. Another reason that makes war so complex is that it's hard to even define what exactly you're trying to win, which leads me into my next narrative. One war, many conflicts. So one of the reasons I wanted to go to Afghanistan was to try to end the conflict there, bring peace to that country. And I was deployed as a civil affairs specialist, it's called. So I had a suitcase full of money, I had an interpreter, and I could go talk to village elders and talk to religious leaders, hand out some money, try to win some hearts and minds. And one of the things I quickly discovered was that we weren't in the middle of just one conflict of like the Taliban versus the government. There was actually a lot of different conflicts. So, for example, the Afghan army was made up mostly of ethnicities from the north, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks. And we were in the Pashtun area in the south. So these different ethnic groups had all had centuries of conflict with each other. And they even spoke different languages. The Afghan army actually had to use our interpreters to talk to the local population. One of the soldiers actually told my interpreter that if we just killed all the Tajiks, then we'd finally have peace. And my interpreter was a Tajik, but this guy was serious. The Afghan police, they were Pashtun, actually, but they were from different districts. They were a lot of fun to hang out with, but they were really corrupt people. So they usually knew where the Taliban were, they knew where they were hiding and who was supporting them, but they weren't really interested in doing much about it. Instead, they focused on getting money out of the locals. They would throw people in jail, for example, and then demand a bribe in order to release them. And the thing is, in Pashtun society, you have this concept of Pashtun Wali, which is like this honor code that really drives the culture, and part of the honor code is revenge. So if someone wrongs you, you've got to get revenge on them. So you end up with a lot of these blood feuds going on between different people and different tribes in the area. And really, they're trying to leverage us, the Marines, or the Afghan government, or the police. They're trying to use us to further their feud. And we had to be very careful not to get wrapped up in that. And so eventually I started understanding that it's not just two conflicts, but it's actually a pyramid of conflicts. This is a good way to visualize it. You have, at the top, you have just a few conflicts which are global. But then you go down this pyramid and you get more and more conflicts as you go down. These are conflicts with smaller and smaller groups, but there's more and more of them. So, for example, it starts with the Al-Qaeda and the US, and it gets down to these blood feuds I'm talking about. And really, if it sounds familiar with all this intrigue and alliances that form, and then they break, and they shift, and they backstab each other, it sounds a lot like Game of Thrones, and that's really the best way to describe it. So if you want a good dramatic example of it, look at Game of Thrones. And it's really complex in this book. You might know it's actually based off a real war from English medieval history. At least that's how part of the inspiration. And it's really complex, but audiences really love this. Why? Why is that? So I would argue that they love it because it's this narrative loop of discovery and surprise. So you enter the world, you're naive, you're not quite sure what's going on, you start to learn the game that's being played around you. You start to learn who are the players and who's who and what are the rules. And just when you think you have it figured out, something surprises you and you gotta learn everything all over again. So this is a great narrative for TV and books, but does this work in video games? I would say there's a good example in Crusader Kings 2, for example. This is a game that's basically a medieval politics simulator. And there's thousands of nobles, and they're all vying for power against each other, and they're breaking alliances and forming alliances and having intrigues. And it's a very powerful, engaging gameplay loop. And 6 years later, this game is still popular. A more recent example might be The Witcher 3. So in this game, they have a pyramid of conflict similar to what I described earlier, which is kind of the backdrop of the world. At the very high level, you have Nilfgaard versus the northern kingdoms, and then you have these lower level conflicts like the different clans in the Skellige Islands that are fighting each other and debating whether to join the bigger war, and then you have personal conflicts. And this gives a really interesting, complex backdrop that the writers can use to make all sorts of plots, all sorts of quests, and they can all tie into each other if they want to. And these are just examples of what you can do. If you have a little bit less killing in your games, you open up space for things like this. And this complexity is something that a lot of audiences really enjoy and find really engaging, which brings me to my next narrative. Narrative number 3, moral complexity. So first of all, let me define what I do not mean by moral complexity. Moral complexity is not moral simplicity. It might sound obvious, but we get them mixed up a lot. So, for example, if it's clear all your choices, what your choices are, and if it's clear which choice is right and which choice is wrong, then you're actually faced with simplicity, not complexity. Just because you're given a choice doesn't make it complex. Moral ambiguity is also not what I'm talking about here. So moral ambiguity is where there is no right, there is no wrong. Everything's just kind of gray. But that's not really how war is. If you're a soldier in a war, your job is to do the right thing. But complexity means it's hard to figure out what the right thing is. You have to do a lot of work to figure it out. And you don't have a lot of time to figure it out sometimes, and lives are on the line. So let me give you an example. So one day, one of our bases got attacked by a rocket. A Marine got thrown out of the guard tower. Luckily, he was completely uninjured. About a week later, we were on patrol near that base, and we just randomly ran into 2 civilians on a motorcycle. And hanging off the side of the motorcycle were bags of rockets. So the point man on the patrol immediately threw up and said, pointed at the motorcycle and said, "Put up your hands." So the guy here that you can see, he threw up his hands and he surrendered. The other guy on the motorcycle ran away. The point man shot at him as he ran away. He got hit, but he ended up escaping, and we found out later he bled to death. So the question is, how do we know if this was the right thing to do in that situation? And in fact, we actually have a legal code called the Law of Land Warfare that helps us here. And one thing you'll notice about this guy is he's not wearing a uniform. He looks like a civilian. He's trying to blend in with the civilian population. That makes him what's called an unlawful combatant. So he and his buddies were unlawful combatant, and it's legal to fight them until they surrender. But how do you know who's a combatant and who's a civilian when they all look the same? So the law actually, again, gives us a guide on this. If somebody is engaging in a hostile act against you, or if they're demonstrating intent to engage in such an act, then you have an inherent right to self-defense, and you can fight. So it sounds pretty simple, but it actually gets really complicated in practice. Here's an example of insurgent tactic in Iraq. So in this case, you've got a freeway overpass. Yes. You've got an overpass, and you've got 2 insurgents standing on it. And they're not carrying any rifles, any weapons, visibly. And one guy is the observer. He's watching for the convoy. The guy behind him is holding a homemade bomb. And when the observer sees the convoy go under the overpass, he signals to the guy with the bomb who's going to drop it down on top of the vehicles inside that hole and to blow up the crew inside. So, and then they run away usually. So imagine you're on a convoy and you see this happen to the vehicle in front of you. And let's say a few of your friends get killed. And then let's say a week later, you're on a convoy again, and you're driving down that same road, and you're coming up on the same overpass, and you see somebody watching you. And you're pretty sure that's the same guy you saw last week. So what do? Are you witnessing hostile intent here? Should you defend yourself right now? Maybe you shoot that guy. Maybe you're trying to protect your friends. And maybe afterwards you go search his body and you find a bomb on it. And so maybe you were right, you protected them. But maybe you search him and you don't find anything, and he was just some innocent civilian that was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe you don't do anything because you can't be sure. And then maybe the vehicle in front of you gets blown up and your friends die. Or maybe there's some other choice that you're not seeing. Maybe you can tell the convoy to stop, and maybe we can send a team up there to search those guys. The point is, in modern warfare, in 21st century warfare, there's all sorts of events like this where you have just a very little amount of time to decide what to do and how to act. The military spends a lot of time and effort trying to train soldiers for these situations so that they'll know what to do when they're in them. But this is all very interesting, but is there any way to put this into a video game, and would it be interesting in a video game? And I would argue that the Telltale Games series do a great job of this all the time. So in these games, you're given a very small amount of time to make very big decisions. And your decisions have consequences, and it's not always clear what's right and what's wrong. And these are very engaging games, and they're very, very complex decisions that you have to make. You could basically use the same techniques here, the same narrative techniques, the same gameplay techniques, set this in the Iraq or Afghan war, and you'd have one of the most realistic and immersive war games ever made. Another good example comes from Spec Ops: The Line. In this scene, you come across your squad mate, Lugo, who was just killed by an angry mob, and then they're now surrounding you, and they're screaming, and they're yelling, and they're angry at you. And your other squad mate, who's still alive, he's getting nervous. He's afraid that you're going to get killed as well by this crowd. And he's asking for permission to shoot the crowd. And you have to make a decision. And it's really interesting because actually, in VBS, we have a lot of features that are designed to train soldiers for situations like this. So the technique you're supposed to use here is actually called escalation of force. And the proper way to handle this, both professionally and morally, is you start with the lowest level of force that will diffuse the situation and that'll keep you and your friends safe. So that might start with strong language. It might escalate to like warning shots. But if necessary, then you go to lethal force, but only if necessary, if nothing else will work. But interestingly, a lot of players, when they're faced with this situation, the game will actually let you fire a warning shot and it will diffuse the situation. The civilians will run away. But most players don't even try doing that at all. They're faced with all this pressure. They've got their buddy yelling at them to shoot at the crowd. Their other buddy just got killed. They're nervous and they're angry and they just shoot the civilians. And the civilians run away and the soldiers make it out alive. But there's women and children that are just lying dead. And so that's sort of some of the complexity that can be faced. And that brings me to my last narrative. Narrative number 4, the civilians pay the highest price. So this is a pretty taboo subject, really, to touch or to talk about in a video game, especially even in regular conversation. It's something we don't really want to talk about. So I wouldn't blame anyone if you wanted to avoid this topic. But let me give you an example of what this looked like in Sangin, at least. So here's a picture of an IED in the ground. And what you'll see is a series of stones. This was placed there by the Taliban in order to warn the civilians that there's an IED there to stay away. So the civilians, the Taliban rather, they're trying to win hearts and minds, just like we are, so they don't want collateral damage of civilians. They want to avoid it if they can. So when we first got to Sangin, the civilians knew where the IEDs were, but they didn't really want to tell us. They didn't really trust us. After we'd been there for a while, we must have been doing something right. They started trusting us more, I guess, and they started coming to us and telling us where these IEDs were. And we would send our EOD teams out there to disarm them. So the Taliban didn't really like that, so they stopped telling the civilians where the IEDs were. And then it ends up looking like this. So in case you can't tell, the IED is buried right there. Now, obviously, these are very hard to spot, and they're also very deadly if you step on them. So I have a question for you. Do you think those two kids would be any better at spotting those IEDs than you would be? So let me tell you another story. So one day we were at the base, we heard an explosion. We checked on the radio, none of our patrols that were out got hit by anything. And we found out about a week later that a young boy stepped on an IED and got blown up. It's not the kids pictured here, but it's actually very similar. They were similar in age. About a week later, we had a patrol that was out near the same house where that one boy got blown up. And they heard an explosion, and they saw smoke. And they rushed over to help. And what they saw was another boy, similar age, again, not pictured here. And he was laying there with his legs blown off in a pool of his blood, bleeding to death. And his parents were nearby, and they were watching this, and they were screaming. They were watching their kid die in front of them. And it was actually the same parents that lost their other son a week earlier. So the squad leader that was with that patrol and his interpreter ran over and started putting tourniquets on the stumps of the kid's leg. But yeah, he bled out, he died. And the thing is that those IEDs that those kids stepped on, those weren't meant for those kids. Those were meant to kill us, to kill the Marines. And they were there because we were there. We were fighting in this kid's backyard, and so there were bombs there. If we wouldn't have been there, those bombs wouldn't have been there, and this kid would have been okay. So this is a pretty dark topic, obviously, and the question is, can games touch on this? And there's a few good examples of it. One example is a game called This War of Mine. It's actually a game set in a war, but you don't play as soldiers, you play as civilians, and your job is to try to stay alive in the war. It's very dark, but it sold 2.5 million copies, and it's received widespread critical acclaim. Very well received, 10 out of 10 on Steam. Another example is from Bohemia Interactive. I don't work on ARMA, by the way, but I was really interested in this DLC. It's called The Laws of War, and in it you play as a aid worker, basically, a humanitarian aid worker, which sounds super boring for a game about shooting people. And one reviewer called it a walking simulator because you spend most of the game walking around disarming landmines. But that same reviewer was like, it was great. It was one of the most emotionally impactful experiences I've ever had in a first-person shooter. And there's a lot of other reviewers that say similar things. It's rated 9 out of 10 on Steam. So there is maybe some space for even uncomfortable topics like this, and even in a game about war. So, to review, war. What else is there? What else can we write about? My first narrative was less killing, more war. Remember war, there's hundreds of tasks, not just shooting. Combat should be dangerous, and if you change your mechanics, it can be, not a cartoon. And if you give the player less killing to do, you have more space for other experiences. Some of them can be violent, some of them can be less violent. Some of them can go from non-violent to violent in the moment, in a very short amount of time. Next narrative, one war, many conflicts. Remember, there's sort of a pyramid of different conflicts, global, local, all the way down to personal. And this can lead you to a narrative loop of discovery, surprise, and rediscovery as you start to unravel all these conflicts and as you work your way through it. And again, a great example is Game of Thrones. Number 3, moral complexity. Again, there's a difference between this and moral simplicity and ambiguity. This means you have to work hard to figure out the right thing to do, but you're trying to do the right thing. The problem is, in modern warfare, you're forced into a lot of these complex situations, and you don't necessarily have a lot of time to figure out what's right. So a great way to implement this in games would be things like time-limited decisions, branching narratives, etc. And finally, number 4, civilians pay the highest price. Both sides in the conflict are always going to cause collateral damage. There's no way it can be avoided, no matter how hard you try. This is a very dark and risky subject, really, to touch on in a game. But if you try, and if you do it successfully, this can lead to some powerful, memorable experiences. And I really just want to kind of close on that note. I want to remind you that stories are very, very powerful things. And writing itself is not easy. Writing, like doing good writing, is very hard. For me, this speech was very hard to write, and it's not even good. That means if you're a writer, and you're a good writer, and you're an effective writer, then you're a very powerful person. You can tell stories that are very powerful. So you have powerful things in your hands, and I would just ask you to please use those things responsibly. Thank you very much.